The brass bubble inside my spirit level sat perfectly still between the black calibration lines, but the floorboard beneath it told a completely different, much more dangerous story. I knelt on the scuffed, century-old hardwood of the second-floor bedroom, dragging the rough pad of my thumb along the jagged hairline fracture radiating outward from the baseboard. The house was quiet, save for the relentless, rhythmic drumming of the Portland rain against the tall, single-pane window panes. But the structural math running through my head was screaming a warning. A quarter-inch deflection over a mere 3-foot span wasn't just typical old house settling. It was a failing load path. Someone, likely decades ago, had removed a sheer wall downstairs to open up the kitchen, and gravity was finally, ruthlessly coming to collect the debt. The silence in the room felt heavy, dense, like the calm before a catastrophic physical collapse. I stood up slowly, the joints in my knees popping, and wiped a smear of dry plaster dust from the heavy canvas of my work pants. I turned my attention away from the structural decay toward the center of the bedroom. Madeline was a whirlwind of anxious, scattered energy, her usual grounded demeanor entirely fractured by the morning's events. She had clothes strewn everywhere, draped haphazardly across the unmade bed, folded over the back of a mid-century armchair and piled high on the vintage wooden dresser. The city's bright yellow condemnation warning was sitting downstairs on her kitchen counter, a ticking legal clock driven by her developer neighbor, Sterling, who wanted this double-lot property bad enough to weaponize the municipal code. I watched her pull a garment from the heavy, open wooden wardrobe behind her. A stark white button-down shirt hung abandoned on the wardrobe door, catching the gray light filtering through the rain-streaked glass. She turned around to face me, holding a thin-strapped, cream-colored silk slip dress against her chest. The soft, diffused lighting caught the deep circles of exhaustion framing her eyes, but despite the threat of losing her home and her art studio by Friday, she still managed a defiant, teasing spark. I caught myself staring. I didn't look at her body. I looked at the sheer contrast of the delicate, fragile fabric held up against her unyielding, tired resilience. I didn't look away fast enough. She caught my gaze, her fingers tightening slightly on the silk straps, her lips curving into a wry, exhausted smile. "Should I change, or keep torturing you?" she asked, her voice a low, raspy hum that somehow cut right through the sound of the storm outside. I felt the sudden, grounding weight of gravity anchor my boots to the uneven floor. My jaw tightened. I shoved my hands deep into the pockets of my jacket, balling my fingers into fists, keeping my posture completely still and rigidly professional. "You're not torturing me, Maddie," I said, my voice deliberately flat, offering her a steady baseline. "But you might want to pack the heavy canvas work shirts first. The municipal inspector isn't going to care about your wardrobe when he red tags the foundation block." I let the practical, cold reality of the situation build a safe, concrete wall between us. Her smile faltered immediately, the teasing armor dropping to the floor to reveal the sheer, overwhelming exhaustion she was trying to hide. She tossed the cream dress onto the armchair, the silk pooling like spilled milk. "Sterling called the city planning office again this morning," she said, her voice entirely stripped of its humor. She walked over to the window, crossing her arms tightly across her chest as she looked out at the rain. "They moved the structural safety inspection up. I don't have until the end of the month anymore. I have exactly 48 hours before they lock the doors and board up my own studio." "Then we have exactly 47 hours to brace the main girder," I replied, stepping past her to examine the window framing, tracing the water damage along the sill. I wasn't going to stand there and let her pack her life into cardboard boxes. I was the only licensed structural engineer in the city who owed her mother a massive favor, and more importantly, I was the only one who could draft and stamp a reinforcement plan today to legally halt the eviction notice. I need my laser measure from the truck, and I need a completely clear path to the basement crawlspace. "Luca, you can't do this," she argued, turning away from the window, her brow furrowed in frustration. Your firm bills commercial clients at $300 an hour. I know because I looked up your website. I can't afford you, and I won't be another charity project for your mother's friends. I stopped calibrating the laser tool in my hand and looked directly at her. I'm not doing this for my mom, I said plainly, my voice carrying no room for debate. Sterling is citing a section code violation from a scrapped plumbing contract 10 years ago. It's a bullying tactic. He wants to scare you into selling the lot at a loss. And I don't like bullies. I didn't wait for her to give me permission. I turned on my heel, my heavy boots thudding against the compromised floorboards, and walked downstairs. I pulled my heavy-duty tactical flashlight from my tool belt. The main floor of the house smelled like damp earth, old cedar, and the sharp tang of impending panic. I found the basement door in the hallway, the hinges screaming as I pulled it open. The crawl space was an absolute nightmare of dark mud and compromised timber. I spent the next 4 hours entirely submerged in the cold, cramped darkness beneath her living room. The air was thick, tasting of mildew and wet dust. I mapped the decayed support columns one by one. Every time I found a failing mortise and tenon joint, I clicked my pen and sketched the complex load transfer onto my waterproof drafting pad. The geometry was a disaster. The central beam was bowing under the weight of the second story, the wood splintering under a load it was never designed to carry. The mud soaked completely through the heavy knees of my jeans, the damp chill settling deep into my bones. But the math was clear and absolute. I could save this structure. I crawled out of the access hatch just after midnight, my back aching, my hands covered in dark, gritty dirt. I wiped my face with the back of my forearm, only to find Madeline sitting silently on the bottom step of the basement stairs. She held a heavy, battered steel thermos in her lap, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. She was wearing an oversized gray sweater, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She didn't say a word as I stood up. She just uncrossed her arms and handed the thermos to me. Our fingers brushed against the warm metal as I took it. It wasn't electric. There was no spark or dramatic jolt. It was entirely grounding. It felt like coming in from a freezing storm and finally finding a hearth. I need 6 6x6 pressure-treated posts and a pair of 20-ton hydraulic jacks, I told her, unscrewing the plastic lid with my relatively clean wrist. The smell of dark roast coffee hit the cold basement air. I'll pull them from my firm's commercial site downtown tomorrow morning at 6. You're going to get yourself fired, she whispered, looking up at the streak of mud on my cheek. Her voice was incredibly soft, entirely stripped of the fierce independence she wore during the day. I own the firm, Maddie, I reminded her, taking a long, scalding drink of the coffee. The heat bloomed in my chest, pushing back the damp chill of the crawlspace. I make the rules, and the rules say I can redirect equipment for an emergency shoring job. I screwed the lid back on and set the thermos down on the wooden stair beside her. Now go upstairs and go to sleep. I'm taking the couch. The quiet, absolute certainty in the cold basement locked a promise into place. I wasn't going to let the roof fall on her. The next afternoon, the harsh reality of the city's timeline crashed violently into us. I was back under the house, lying on my back in the mud, wrestling a massive temporary steel hydraulic jack into a vertical position beneath the sagging floor joist. My muscles burned, the heavy wrench slipping in my grip as I cranked the pressure valve. Suddenly, the heavy, authoritative thud of boots sounded on the floorboards directly above my face. It was 2 p.m. The inspector wasn't due until tomorrow morning. I locked the hydraulic valve immediately, ensuring the load was secured, and scrambled backward out of the narrow access hatch. I wiped a thick layer of black grease onto my shop rag, my heart rate accelerating not from panic, but from the sudden, sharp shift in the tactical landscape. I found Madeline in the kitchen. She was physically backed against the edge of the marble island, cornered by a man in a neon yellow city utility jacket holding a metal clipboard. Mr. Sterling stood smugly on the porch just outside the open screen door, his hands tucked into the pockets of his expensive slacks, watching the execution of his plan. "You can't do an early audit without a 24-hour formal written notice," Madeline was saying. Her voice was steady, but I saw her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles were stark white. "I have a signed report of imminent structural failure from a concerned neighbor, Ms. Gardner," the inspector said, his tone bored, loud, and heavily bureaucratic. He tapped his pen against the clipboard. "Under emergency provisions, I have the authority to red tag this property and order an immediate evacuation." I stepped fully into the kitchen, dropping my heavy, solid steel wrench directly onto the marble island. The loud, sharp clang echoed like a gunshot in the small room, making both the inspector and Sterling physically jump. Section 402 of the Municipal Code requires a licensed structural engineer's assessment before an imminent failure tag can be legally issued, I said, my voice a flat, hard, unyielding line. I reached into my back pocket, pulled out my rolled, physically stamped blueprints, and slammed them down next to the wrench. "I am the engineer of record for this property. The load is currently stabilized. I have temporary hydraulic shoring in place, transferring the shear weight directly to the bedrock foundation. The permanent posts are going in right now. You can inspect the permit filing on your tablet. It went through the digital portal at 7 a.m. The kitchen went dead silent. The inspector blinked, entirely thrown off his script. He pulled up his city-issued tablet, his thumb swiping across the screen. Sterling frowned deeply on the porch, his manufactured leverage evaporating instantly in the face of measured, documented reality. "I see the filing," the inspector muttered, his aggressive posture deflating. "But the permanent fix needs to be inspected and signed off by Friday at noon." "It will be," I said. I stepped smoothly between Madeline and the door, using my broader frame to physically shield her from Sterling's hostile glare. I didn't puff out my chest, I just stood my ground. "Now, unless you have a hard hat and steel-toed boots, you are currently standing in an active construction zone without proper PPE. I'll have to ask you to step outside." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten him. I just stated the regulatory facts, leaving absolutely no room for debate. The inspector nodded stiffly, turned, and walked out, gesturing for Sterling to follow him. When the front door finally clicked shut, the silence in the house was deafening. Madeline let out a long, shaky exhale, the adrenaline rapidly leaving her system. She reached out blindly and grabbed my forearm. Her grip was tight, desperate, her fingers digging into the thick canvas of my jacket. I stood perfectly still. I didn't pull her into a hug. I didn't try to stroke her hair or offer empty, soothing platitudes. I just let my physical stability flow into her panic. I kept my free hand resting casually at my side, actively refusing to take advantage of her vulnerability. "I handled it," I said quietly, keeping my voice low and even. "They're gone." The tremor in her hand slowly stopped. She looked down at where she was gripping my arm, then slowly let go, taking a deep breath to center herself. "You lied," she said, looking up at me. "You didn't file that permit at 7 a.m. "I filed it at 6:45 a.m., I corrected her, picking up my wrench. "I never bluff with the city. The math is real, Maddie. You're safe." By Thursday night, the physical toll of the accelerated timeline was incredibly heavy. I had spent the last 8 hours driving the final half-inch lag bolts into the newly installed pressure-treated support beams. The house was finally, mathematically, level. The property war wasn't completely over. We still had to face the zoning board for the final permit hearing in the morning, but the physical house was no longer a threat to her safety. I walked heavily up the stairs from the basement, my shoulder muscles aching with a deep, dull burn, a tension headache pounding relentlessly behind my eyes. I wiped my hands on a clean rag, following the sound of movement to the back of the house. Madeline was in her art studio, a large, airy room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the backyard. She was moving heavy cardboard boxes of canvas and oil paints back onto her wooden shelves. She was meticulously peeling the blue painter's tape off the doorframe, a task she had started days ago when she thought she was packing to leave. She was actively reclaiming her space. "You're working late," I noted, leaning my tired shoulder against the door jamb, content just to watch her move with purpose. She looked back at me over her shoulder, pausing to wipe a streak of dust from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "I'm not letting Sterling think he scared me out of this room for even a minute." She walked over to her cluttered desk, pushing aside a stack of charcoal sketches, and picked up a clean, thick white envelope. "I called an old client. I sold a commission today. It's an advance." She walked over and held the envelope out to me. "It's enough to pay for the materials you bought from your firm." I looked down at the paper, then back up at her face. Taking that money felt wrong. It felt like putting a cheap price tag on the last 4 days of mud and exhaustion, reducing the quiet trust we had built into a simple, cold transaction. But refusing it would completely strip her of her pride and agency. She needed to feel like she was fighting this war, not just being rescued from it. I reached out and took the envelope, sliding it into the inside pocket of my jacket. "Thank you. I'll get you a receipt for the lumber." "No," she said, her voice dropping to a softer, much more vulnerable register. She took a half step closer. "Thank you, Luca. Nobody has ever just stood there and taken the hit for me before." The distance between us had evaporated. I could smell the faint, comforting trace of her vanilla soap cutting through the harsh smell of sawdust and oil paint in the room. I clenched my jaw, fighting the immediate, powerful urge to close the final inch between us. I wanted to pull her in, to feel the profound relief of holding her, to block out the noise of the city and the impending hearing. But she needed an ally right now. She needed a shield, not a complication. I took a deliberate, highly controlled half-step back, reestablishing the physical boundary. "Get some sleep, Maddie," I said, my voice rougher than I intended, betraying the immense effort it took to step away. "I'll meet you at the municipal building at 8. We have a hearing to win." I turned and walked out the front door into the dark, leaving a massive piece of my focus behind in that studio. The city permit office on Friday morning was a sterile, unforgiving room lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes. Sterling was already sitting in the front row of the gallery, wearing a tailored suit and looking incredibly smug. I sat directly beside Madeline in the uncomfortable wooden chairs, a thick, heavy binder of structural calculations resting on my lap. When the clerk called her name, she stood up immediately. I stood up right beside her, my shoulder brushing hers. "Ms. Gardner," the zoning board chairman said, looking down his nose over his reading glasses. "The city inspector noted temporary, unapproved shoring at your residence on Tuesday. Has the permanent engineered fix been finalized, or are we executing the condemnation order today?" Madeline didn't look at me for permission. She didn't shrink away from the microphone. She looked directly at the board members. "Yes. The foundation has been completely and legally retrofitted to current municipal code. My engineer has the final sign-off documents." She turned and gestured to me, introducing me to the room not just as a hired contractor, but as her absolute partner in this fight. I stepped forward to the podium, placing the heavy binder down with a solid thud. "The structural integrity of the main load-bearing wall now exceeds city safety requirements by 40%. I stated clearly, opening the binder to the stamped architectural drawings. "The property is completely secure. The complaint filed by Mr. Sterling is technically and legally baseless as of this morning." The chairman spent 3 agonizing minutes reviewing the stamped pages, checking my license number against the city database. Finally, he looked up and nodded. "The math is sound. Case dismissed. The red tag is officially lifted." Sterling stood up abruptly in the front row, his face flushed with sudden public anger, and stormed out of the double doors. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been hanging over Madeline's life for 6 weeks finally, completely dissolved. We walked out of the municipal building in silence, stepping out into the damp Portland air. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the concrete sidewalks slick and shining under a break in the gray clouds. She turned to face me on the steps, the chronic tension completely gone from her shoulders. She looked remarkably lighter. "It's over," she breathed, looking up at me, her eyes bright. "It's over," I confirmed, my voice steady. She didn't hesitate this time. She didn't wait for a signal. She reached up, framing my face with both of her warm hands, and pressed her lips to mine. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't an exploration. It was an absolute destination. It was the distinct, undeniable feeling of locking a heavy deadbolt on a safe door, a quiet, profound promise that the foundation was finally secure and the storm was outside. I let my hands come out of my pockets, resting them lightly on her waist, grounding myself in the incredible reality that I didn't have to walk away or step back this time. We had built something genuinely solid. Closing thoughts. I learned that true integrity isn't just about doing the math correctly. It's about showing up when the structure of someone's life is failing and refusing to walk away. Real love isn't found in dramatic, chaotic passion. It's found in the quiet consistency of building a safe foundation that can hold you both up when the world pushes back. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.